I was lying in that hospital bed at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon when I heard my oldest son, Eduardo, tell his sister that I was just taking up space and that it would be better if I had left soon. My entire body was paralyzed on the left side from the stroke I suffered 3 days earlier, but my mind was completely clear, each word piercing my chest like sharp glass. Carolina, my middle daughter, responded in that cold voice that I didn't recognize, saying that they needed to speed things up because the maintenance of my house was costing $2,400 a month and that I could remain in that vegetative state for years. I tried to scream. I tried to move my right hand, which was still responding a little, but I only managed to emit a muffled groan that they completely ignored. Roberto, the youngest, was leaning against the wall looking at his cell phone and said without looking up that he had already spoken to a broker and that the house could be sold for 600,000 reais quickly if they would accept 450,000 in cash. My heart raced so much that the monitor next to the bed started to beep, but they didn't even look. They continued talking about dividing the money into 3 equal parts, 150,000 for each one, as if I were already dead. The nurse came running in because of the monitor's alarm, and they finally shut up, put fake smiles on their faces, and Eduardo even held my hand with that cold, mechanical pressure, saying in a loud, artificial voice that everything was fine, that Mom was going to be fine. Tears flowed from my eyes, but they interpreted it as an involuntary reaction to the stroke, not as the desperation of someone who had just discovered that the 3 children I carried in my womb, breastfed and raised alone after their father died, were counting the minutes until I disappeared for good. My name is Carmen Torres, I'm 67 years old, I live in San Antonio, Texas, and at that exact moment at 2:12 in the afternoon, I discovered that my entire family was a lie built over decades. Before continuing, if you have already experienced family betrayal, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because this story goes far and revenge will be proportional to the pain. Comment which city you're watching from, because I need to know I'm not alone in this. The nurse adjusted the serum, checked my blood pressure, which was at 160 to 100, and left the room, leaving the door ajar. Eduardo waited exactly 30 seconds, looking at the corridor before speaking again, this time in a lower voice, but still perfectly audible to me. He took a folded piece of paper from the pocket of his navy blue dress pants that I had paid for 2 years ago, $420 at Macy's for him to use at work meetings, and showed it to his brothers. It was a power of attorney that he had drawn up with a lawyer, Dr. Marcus Sullivan, office in downtown San Antonio on the main plaza, giving me full powers to manage my assets while I was incapacitated. The problem is that I never signed that power of attorney. Carolina took the paper and examined it with those green eyes she inherited from her father, eyes that I used to find beautiful, but that at that moment looked like a snake, and asked if the signature would pass as authentic. Eduardo replied yes, that he had practiced copying my handwriting from at least 20 old documents he found in my office drawer, electricity bills, rent receipts from when I lived in the small apartment before buying the house, income tax returns from the last 15 years. Roberto finally put away his cell phone and approached the bed, looked me straight in the face with an expression that was pure cold analysis, like someone evaluating a used car, and said that the doctors had given only a 30% chance of a significant recovery, that I would probably need permanent care for the rest of my life. Physical therapy 5 times a week at $140 a session, plus a speech therapist. More medicine that would easily cost $2,000 a month, even with insurance, and that it didn't make economic sense to keep all of this going. Carolina agreed, nodding her head, her blonde hair falling over her shoulders, hair that she kept that way by spending $300 a month at a salon that I helped pay for years, and added that they had talked to the social worker and that there were already places for people in my state. Nursing homes that accepted Medicaid where I could be well taken care of while they organized their life. Eduardo folded the forged power of attorney and put it back in his pocket carefully. Then he looked at me for the first time since they entered the room, his brown eyes completely empty of any affection, and said in a low but clear voice that it was for my own friend. Well, I wouldn't want to be a burden to them. that I've always been an independent and strong woman, and that I certainly wouldn't want to be dependent on my children in my old age. I tried again to move my right arm. I managed to lift my hand about 5 centimeters from the mattress. I tried to point at them, to make any gesture that would show that I was understanding everything. But my arm fell heavily back down, and they didn't even notice because they were already turning to leave. Roberto stopped at the door and commented that the agent could take a possible buyer to see the house on Saturday, 4 days from now, that they needed to go there first and remove some valuable things, Grandma's jewelry that was left to me, and that was in the safe in my room worth at least $40,000, their father's Rolex watch that I kept as an heirloom, and that was worth $35,000. The collection of antique coins that I started to assemble 20 years ago and that an appraiser had said was worth $50,000. Carolina made a practical observation saying that they needed to be quick because after I was transferred to the nursing home, someone could question the power of attorney if it took too long to move the goods. Eduardo replied that he had already thought about it, that in fact the best thing would be not to wait for me to leave the hospital. They could start emptying the house this week, taking everything that was valuable to keep in their homes and sharing them later calmly. They walked out talking in the hallway, and their voices trailed off as they discussed which day each had available to go to my house, that red brick house on Oak Street that I bought with sweat and blood, working 52 years without stopping. I was alone in the hospital room with its faded light green walls, the smell of disinfectant mixed with reheated food, the sound of the heart monitor beeping faster and faster as my chest rose and fell in short, desperate breaths. I looked at the damp-stained white ceiling and tried to process what had just happened. My 3 children, the 3 human beings I loved most in the world, to whom I had dedicated every second of my existence after Roberto died, my husband, their father, that wonderful man who was taken from me by pancreatic cancer 14 years ago, were planning to discard me like trash. It wasn't anger that I felt at that first moment. It was a deep confusion, an inability to connect the reality of what I had heard with the image I had of them in my head. Eduardo was always responsible, the oldest, born when I was 23, he who took on the role of man of the house when his father died, he who hugged me on birthdays saying I was the best mother in the world. Carolina was my only girl, the middle one, born 2 years after Eduardo, the one who called me every Sunday to talk, the one who asked for advice about everything, the one who cried on my shoulder when her marriage ended 5 years ago. The youngest, Roberto, was my baby, born when I was 30, the most sensitive of the 3, or at least that's what I believed. The one who lived with me until he was 28, the one I helped him start his own business by lending $35,000 that he swore he would return, and never did. How did those 3 people turn into the cold monsters that just came out of my room? I tried to remember the last few months looking for signs that I had ignored, and I realized that yes, the signs were all there screaming, but I was deaf due to a mother's blind love. The visits that became shorter and more mechanical, the phone calls that became less frequent. Christmas last year where they arrived late and left early with lame excuses, my 67th birthday in March where none of the 3 of them showed up in person. They only sent generic messages via WhatsApp, Easter, that I spent completely alone because everyone had other commitments. When I called to talk, the answers were increasingly monosyllabic. I'm busy, Mom. I'll call you later. Now I can't. I'm in the middle of something important. When I suggested we have lunch together, there was always an excuse. Eduardo with a work meeting, Carolina with her children's school commitments, Roberto with a trip scheduled. The last time I managed to get the 3 of them together was on Thanksgiving last year, more than a year ago, and even then they spent the whole time looking at their cell phones. They left right after dessert without helping to wash the dishes. They left me alone to clean up the mess and put away the leftovers that no one wanted to take. I attributed everything to the fact that they were adults busy with their own lives. I blamed myself for being too demanding, for wanting too much attention, for not understanding that they had responsibilities. What an idiot I was. The truth is that they had already given me emotionally discarded for a long time. I just didn't realize it, because I was too busy convincing myself that I had raised good people. I started shaking uncontrollably in bed, tremors that weren't just from the stroke but from pure terror, and the nurse came running back, thinking I was having a seizure. She held me by the shoulders, speaking in a calm voice for me to try to relax, that everything was okay, that it was normal to have these reactions after a severe stroke like mine. He gave me a calming serum, and little by little my body stopped shaking, but my mind continued to race. I thought about how I had arrived at that hospital 3 days earlier, on Saturday morning, when I was alone at home making breakfast, and suddenly I felt an explosive headache on my left side. My vision went blurry, and my left arm fell heavy to my side. I managed to grab the phone with my right hand and dial 911 before it fell to the kitchen floor. The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes. The paramedics found me conscious, but unable to speak properly. They rushed me to Mercy Hospital with the siren on. I spent 2 days in the ICU before being transferred to the regular room where I was now. Eduardo was the first to arrive at the hospital, about 4 hours after I was admitted, and I remember feeling enormous relief when I saw his face appearing at the ICU door. I thought I was finally safe, that my son would take care of everything. He held my hand, kissed my forehead, told me I was going to be okay, that he was there. Carolina arrived the next day from Austin, where she lived, 3 hours away, and also acted like a worried daughter, brought flowers, and sat next to me for 2 hours. Roberto only showed up on the 3rd day, claiming he was in Dallas for work and hadn't been able to get back sooner. But when he arrived, he also hugged him tightly, even cried, saying he was desperate with the news. I believed everything. My brain was still processing the trauma of the stroke. I was vulnerable, scared, confused, and their presence gave me comfort, even though the visits were short and they spent more time in the hallway talking to each other than actually in the room with me. Now I understood that those conversations in the hallway were exactly what I heard today, about how to get rid of me in the most profitable way possible. The morphine from the tranquilizer started to take effect, and I felt my eyes getting heavy. I fought against sleep because I was afraid of going to sleep and waking up already thrown in some horrible nursing home, but my body won, and I passed out. I woke up at night. The room was dark, with only the dim light from the hallway coming in through the half-open door and the green glow of the monitor next to me. I stared at the ceiling, trying to organize my thoughts, trying to decide what to do. Technically, I was trapped in that body that didn't respond properly, unable to speak understandably, unable to write with the left hand that I always used for everything, unable even to press the nurse call button because it was on the left side of the bed and my left arm was completely dead. But my mind worked perfectly. I understood every word I heard. I could think clearly. I could plan. The problem was communicating. I stayed up all night practicing tiny movements with my right hand. I discovered that I could close my fingers into a fist. I could point with my index finger even though it was shaking. I could make a yes and no movement with my head, even though it was slow. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next morning, when the nurse came to check my vital signs at 6 o'clock, it was a different woman from the day before, older, about 50 years old, gray hair tied in a bun. Name on the badge said, Sandra Mendoza. She had a more attentive way than the others. She spoke to me looking into my eyes, not through me. She asked if I was comfortable, if I needed something. She waited to see if I tried to respond. I tried hard to move my right hand and point at her. Then I pointed at myself. She understood that I wanted to communicate something and brought a small whiteboard with a pen, holding it in position so I could try to write. My hand was shaking violently, but I managed to make lines that spelled out the word help. Sandra looked at the word, looked at me with a more serious expression, and asked if someone was hurting me. I nodded, tears flowing. She asked if it was someone from the hospital, but I said no. He asked if it was family. I said yes. She put the painting aside, pulled out a chair, and sat next to me, said in a low voice that she would listen to me, but that I needed to try to be clear because this type of situation was delicate. I spent the next 15 minutes making a superhuman effort to write fragmented words on the board, each letter a shaky sacrifice, but I managed to communicate the essentials. Children, false power of attorney, selling the house, throwing myself away. Sandra read everything twice, bit her lip, then told me that she was going to talk to the hospital social worker and that they would take action, but that I needed to understand that without concrete proof it was complicated, because technically I was legally incapacitated at the moment. She asked if I had a lawyer, but I shook my head. He asked if he had anyone he could trust besides his children, but I said no again, feeling the weight of loneliness. All my close friends were the same age or older. Some had already died, others were in a fragile situation. None of them would have the capacity to help me fight 3 determined adults with a hired lawyer. Sandra shook my good hand and promised she would do her best. Then she left the room and I stayed there praying that someone would believe in me. 2 hours later, the social worker entered the room, a young woman of about 35, thin, with red-rimmed glasses, speaking quickly and efficiently. I said that Nurse Sandra had reported my attempt to communicate, that I took this type of report very seriously, but that I needed to investigate before taking any action. She would talk to my children when they came to visit. She would assess family dynamics. She would consult doctors about my real level of cognitive ability. I was terrified because I knew my children were smart. They would put on the perfect show of devoted children. They would convince any social worker of good intentions. And that's exactly what happened. Eduardo arrived to visit at noon, alone, bringing fresh flowers and a magazine he knew I liked reading before the stroke. The social worker was in the room when he entered, and I saw the instant change in his behavior, the perfect mask being put on. He politely greeted the social worker, asked how I was, approached the bed and kissed my forehead with all that falseness. The social worker, who had introduced herself as Jennifer Martinez, said she wanted to talk to him about plans for his mother's ongoing care. Eduardo sat in the chair next to the bed, crossed his legs, put on an expression of genuine concern that would have completely fooled me if I didn't know the truth, and began talking about how devastated he and his brothers were about my stroke, how they were researching the best rehabilitation options, how they wanted to ensure I had the best care possible, regardless of the cost. I said that they were considering hiring 24-hour private caregivers to stay with me at home when I was discharged, that they had already budgeted and it was costing about $8,000 a month, but that it would be worth every penny. It was all a perfect, elaborate lie. Jennifer asked some questions about the family's financial situation, whether there were resources to pay for prolonged treatment. Eduardo replied yes, that I had savings in properties, that I had worked my entire life and was a well-off woman, and that he, as the eldest son, had power of attorney to manage everything while I recovered. When he said the word proxy, my heart stopped, and I desperately tried to make some sound, some movement that would alert the social worker. But all I could do was make a moan that Eduardo immediately interpreted out loud as physical discomfort, asking Jennifer to check if I needed more pain medicine. She adjusted my position on the bed, asked if it was better. I tried to shake my head no, but my motor control was so precarious that the movement was ambiguous. Eduardo continued talking to her for another 10 minutes, showing research he had done on his cell phone about rehabilitation centers, mentioning that he had even visited 2 excellent places in San Antonio with 5-star reviews. Jennifer left the room, visibly impressed with her devoted son, and Eduardo kept up his act until she disappeared from the hallway. Then his face changed completely. The smile disappeared. He looked at me with cold eyes and said in a low voice that I shouldn't have tried to talk to anyone, that it wouldn't do any good, that he had everything documented and that anyone looking from the outside would see 3 worried children taking care of a sick mother. He got up, threw the magazine on the table, said he would be back the next day and left without saying goodbye. I spent that entire afternoon at the bottom of the darkest pit of my life, darker even than when Roberto died. Because when I lost my husband, at least I had my children by my side. I had a purpose in continuing for them. I had love to give and receive. Now I had nothing. I was literally trapped in a broken body, surrounded by people who wanted me to disappear without any allies, with no apparent way out. I cried until I had no more tears. The pillow was soaked. My head throbbed with pain. I remembered all the times I gave up things for them, all the times I put their needs before mine. I remembered when Eduardo was 18 years old and wanted to go to college at an expensive university, Rice University in Houston. Tuition fee of $52,000 a year. I was working 2 jobs at the time, during the day as an administrative assistant earning $35,000 a year, and at night as a waitress in a restaurant earning another $20,000 in tips. I slept 5 hours a night, woke up at 5 in the morning, came home at midnight, and it still wouldn't be enough. I sold the only valuable asset I had, a deed to a small piece of land that my father had left to me when he died. I sold it for $60,000 and used it all to pay for Eduardo's first year of college. He graduated in business 4 years later, got a good job at a consulting firm, now earns more than $150,000 a year, and has never offered to pay back a cent. Carolina had 3 children in a marriage that ended badly. Her ex-husband disappeared and didn't pay child support. She was left alone with young children and without a job because she had given up her career to be a housewife. Who helped? Me. I paid for daycare for the 3 of them for 2 years, totaling $1,800 a month, $21,600 a year, $43,200 in total. I bought clothes, school supplies, toys, medicine, food. When she finally got a job and started to stabilize herself, she never talked about giving anything back, and I never covered it because she was my daughter, my granddaughter's. Roberto was the worst case of dependency. He lived with me until 28 years old without paying rent or bills, eating my food, using my internet and electricity. Then when he left, it was because he wanted to open a landscaping business, take care of gardens, and he asked me to borrow $35,000 to buy equipment and a used truck. I had just paid off my house after 30 years of paying the mortgage. I was 55 years old, and for the first time in my life I had a bank account with money left over. I gave him the $35,000 with a promise to pay in 2 years. It's been 12 years, he's never paid $1, the business has prospered, he now has 3 trucks and 6 employees, he earns well, but my money has evaporated. I mentally calculated, lying in that bed, how many years of my life I spent working. I started when I was 15, helping my mother clean houses after school. I worked officially from the age of 18 to 66 when I finally retired last year. 48 years of registered work. And that's not counting the teenage years. 48 years of waking up early, taking the bus, working jobs that destroyed my body and mind, putting up with bad bosses, difficult colleagues, abusive clients, all to ensure that my children had a better life than mine. And I did it. They did. Eduardo lives in a $250,000 house in a good neighborhood, has a German car, travels to Europe every year. Carolina has her own apartment costing $180,000. Her daughters go to private school. Roberto has a $300,000 house with a pool. All fulfilled, all comfortable, all built on my sacrifice. And now they discarded me because I was no longer good for anything. It must have been around 7 in the evening when Sandra returned for her shift. She came straight to check on me, saw my face swollen from crying, and asked in a gentle voice if the conversation with the social worker had helped. I shook my head. She sighed and said that unfortunately this type of situation was common, vulnerable elderly people being exploited by family members, but that without proof it was almost impossible to intervene legally. She asked if I had any documents kept at home that proved something, anything that I could use to my advantage. I thought frantically. The false power of attorney was with Eduardo. I had no way of getting it. But then I remembered that in my home office, inside the file drawer, I had copies of all the checks I wrote to them over the years. I had old bank statements showing transfers. I even had some emails exchanged where they asked to borrow money promising to pay it back. There was also an original will that I made 10 years ago where I left everything divided equally between the 3, but with a specific clause that Roberto needed to pay off the $35,000 debt first. I tried to communicate this to Sandra through the whiteboard. I wrote House Documents Drawer Office. She read it, understood that there were important papers at my residence. He asked where I kept the house key. I replied that I had one in my bag that was in the small closet in the hospital room. Sandra opened the closet, took my old and worn brown leather bag, looked through it and found my set of keys. She looked at me and said that technically what she was about to do could cost her her job, but that she had seen too many cases of family abuse to sit idly by. She told me the following. Her shift ended at 8 at night. She was going to use the hour off she had between shifts to go to my house, get the documents I indicated, and bring them back before anyone noticed. She wrote down my address, which I managed to spell by pointing to the letters she was showing, Oak Street number 2347. She left at 8:05, and I stayed in bed praying that my children wouldn't decide to come over at that exact moment. Sandra returned at 9:40. 2 hours had passed that felt like 2 years. She entered the room sweaty and agitated, locked the door behind her, and took from her large purse a folder of documents that she had taken from my drawer. He said that he had managed to find everything, that the house was empty and locked, that there was no problem. She sat on the chair next to my bed, and we began an exhaustive communication process where she showed document by document, and I indicated yes or no with my head if it was important. There was a check for $18,000 written to Eduardo in 2012 to help with the down payment on his car. There was a bank transfer of $25,000 to Carolina in 2017 to help after the divorce. There was a check for $35,000 for Roberto in 2013 with a note on the back saying loan to be paid in 24 months. I had statements showing payments for college, daycare, countless other things. There were printed emails where they thanked us profusely, promised to never forget, and swore they would return it as soon as they could. My original will was dated and notarized. And Sandra had done something brilliant. She had taken photos of everything on her cell phone before bringing the documents, so there was a digital backup. She put everything back in her briefcase and hid it in the back of the hospital room closet behind extra towels and sheets where no one would look. Then she told me that the next day she was going to call a lawyer she knew who did pro bono work for elderly people in vulnerable situations. A lawyer called David Foster, a small office close to the hospital. She was going to try to make an urgent appointment for him to come and talk to me directly at the hospital. I thanked her with teary eyes, and she just shook my hand saying that no one deserved to be treated like that by their own family. David Foster appeared the following afternoon, a man of about 40, red-headed, with a trimmed beard, a serious but kind expression. Sandra had briefed him on the situation, and he came prepared with a digital recorder to record everything I could communicate. We spent almost 2 hours in the slow and torturous process of communicating through a whiteboard, gestures with his right hand, shaking his head, and he repeated out loud what he understood to confirm with me. When he finished, he had the complete story. He had understood my children's scheme. He had seen all the documents that Sandra had rescued. He explained that technically I was not banned. The doctors had not issued a report of mental incapacity, only physical, so I still had all my legal rights intact. Just because I couldn't speak or write properly didn't mean I was mentally incompetent. He was going to register a preventive action, a kind of advance court order blocking any transaction involving my assets until there was medical expertise proving my cognitive capacity, which expertise he was going to request immediately. He was also going to file a complaint of document forgery against Eduardo using the forged power of attorney. I was going to notify my 3 children about legal action and a ban on them selling or removing anything from my house. He said that the whole process would take a few days, but that it would start immediately. He asked me to officially hire him as a lawyer. I nodded yes. He recorded my consent on video, asking me questions that I answered with clear gestures. Then he left, promising to return in 48 hours with first updates. My children didn't visit during those 2 days, which was strange even for their standards, and later I found out from Sandra that the morning shift nurse had mentioned to them over the phone that a social worker was investigating an anonymous report of possible financial abuse, and that perhaps it would be better not to visit too much so as not to seem like they were pressuring them. So they stayed away waiting for the storm to pass. It was exactly the time David needed. He returned Friday morning with news. A medical examination had been carried out on Thursday by the hospital's own neuropsychologist, Dr. Kenneth Wright, and a report had been issued. I was capable of and cognitive function preserved. I understood instructions. I demonstrated adequate judgment when making decisions about my assets. I only had motor and speech limitations resulting from the stroke that were reversible with rehabilitation. Report was attached to the process. Court order blocking transactions was granted by Judge Hamilton Moore on Thursday afternoon. Documents were registered at the property registry on Friday morning, placing an impediment on all my real estate assets. A bailiff went to the 3 children's homes to deliver notifications in person. Eduardo received his at 8 in the morning on Friday at his house. Carolina received it at her apartment at 9. Roberto received it at his company's office at 10:30. Notifications informed about a judicial blockade, an investigation into forged power of attorney, a ban on access to my home, and a civil action that I was taking against the 3 of them for financial abuse of the elderly, moral damage, attempted fraud, misappropriation, and illicit enrichment. Action values: $600,000 in compensation plus return of all borrowed amounts with interest and correction totaling another $240,000. $840,000 in total. David showed me a copy of the notifications and said that reactions usually came quickly. He wasn't wrong. Less than 3 hours later, at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, Eduardo appeared at the hospital red with anger, entered my room like a hurricane, and started screaming, asking what the hell I had done, how I had managed to hire a lawyer if I could barely move an arm, who was manipulating me, that this was absurd, and he was going to prove that I was being influenced by someone with malicious intent. Sandra was in the room with me when he entered. She immediately pressed the emergency button, and 2 hospital security guards appeared within 30 seconds. David Foster had anticipated exactly this reaction and had advised hospital staff about not allowing aggressive visitors. The security guards asked Eduardo to calm down or leave. He continued shouting that he was his son, that he had the right to visit his mother, but the tone was so clearly aggressive that they gave him the option of leaving voluntarily or being escorted. He looked at me lying in bed with pure hatred in his eyes and said that I was going to regret it, that he was going to prove that I was senile, that he was going to forcibly admit me to a psychiatric asylum, that I didn't know who he was messing with. Then he went out knocking on the door. Security guards stood guard outside my room for the rest of the day. Carolina tried to call my cell phone about 10 times in a row, but my cell phone had been in the drawer and switched off since the day of the stroke, so she couldn't reach me. Roberto sent an angry text message on WhatsApp that Sandra read to me, saying that I was making a huge mistake, that they were my children and were just trying to protect me, that the lawyer was clearly a scammer trying to get my money, that I was being the victim of abuse by people who barely knew me. It was so pathetic to see them reversing roles, playing victims, that I almost laughed despite the gravity of everything. Weekend passed with them trying various tactics. On Saturday morning, the 3 of them appeared together at the hospital asking to speak to me, but they were blocked by security. They demanded to speak to the hospital administrator, made a fuss, threatened to sue the hospital for parental alienation, a ridiculous term considering I was 67 years old. Administrator listened, reviewed court orders that David had left a copy of, upheld the decision not to allow visits without supervision and without my consent. As I said no when they asked if I wanted to see them, they were sent away. Saturday afternoon, Eduardo hired his lawyer, a large and expensive firm in the city, Dr. Richard Hayes. On Monday, the lawyer filed a countersuit alleging that I was under undue influence from third parties, requesting a complete psychiatric evaluation, questioning the validity of the previous neuropsychological report. It was an expected strategy. David said the judge wouldn't accept it without concrete evidence, and he was right. Tuesday had a preliminary hearing. David was representing my interest with a power of attorney that I signed using my right hand with great difficulty, but the signature was recognized by graphotechnical expertise as genuine. Eduardo's lawyer presented the power of attorney that Eduardo had forged, but David immediately asked for graphotechnical expertise on it as well. An examination was carried out at the hearing itself by a court expert. It took 40 minutes to analyze. The conclusion was obvious. The signature was forged, there were clear inconsistencies, the pen pressure was different. The characteristic tremor in my right hand after the stroke was not present because the paper had been forged before the stroke. Eduardo was caught red-handed lying to the judge. His lawyer was in a situation. Horrible, he tried to argue that it had been a mistake, that the client was under emotional stress and had made an error in judgment, but the damage had been done. Judge Hamilton Moore was not happy at all. He said that document forgery was a very serious crime, that he was sending copies of everything to the public prosecutor's office to evaluate the criminal case, and that all the defendant's actions were suspended until the case was fully judged. The blocking of assets was maintained, the ban on accessing my home was maintained and reinforced, and the judge even added a temporary restraining order preventing the three from approaching me within 100 meters outside the court. I was still in the hospital, but was expected to be discharged at the end of that week. Intensive physiotherapy had given surprising results. I was able to move my left arm a little more, my left leg responded with support, my speech had improved to the point where I could say simple words, although slurred. David visited me every day with updates. He had gotten a court order to access my children's bank records for the last 10 years, was building a robust case of how many times they had asked for money, borrowed it and not given it back, how much they had benefited financially from me. It turned out that Roberto had used my name as a guarantor on a loan of $80,000 to expand his business 3 years ago, a loan that he almost didn't repay and that had put my name at risk in the Brazilian Serasa equivalent, which is the American Credit Bureau. It turned out that Carolina had transferred the car title that I paid for into her name without my authorization. It turned out that Eduardo had withdrawn $22,000 from a joint account that he convinced me to open with him years ago for emergencies, but that he used to renovate his house. Each discovery was further proof. David was confident that in addition to winning the main action, he would also reach individual agreements with each person where they would have to return everything with interest to avoid more serious criminal proceedings. I was discharged from the hospital on Friday, 2 weeks and 3 days after the initial stroke. Weight had dropped to 53 kilos, but general condition was stable. David had arranged everything for my return home. He hired a home care company with 2 caregivers who would take turns in 12-hour shifts, Angela on the day shift and Rosa on the night shift, both Mexican women in their 50s, experienced and kind. The house had been legally locked, so none of my children had been able to get in. Everything was exactly as I left it on the day of the stroke. Coffee still moldy on the kitchen table, dishes in the sink. Caregivers cleaned everything in the first few days. Coming back to my house was emotionally overwhelming. Every room had memories, photos hanging on the walls from when the children were little, drawings they made at school that I had framed, dishes I received as gifts on birthdays, a crochet blanket that Carolina had made for me one Christmas 20 years ago. Everything seemed fake now, a decoration for a life that never really existed. The first thing I did when I was able to walk with a walker was take all the photos of them off the walls and store them in a box in the basement. I didn't want to see their faces. Therapists started coming to the house 3 times a week. A physical therapist for mobility, a speech therapist for speech, an occupational therapist to relearn daily tasks. I was making good, slow, but steady progress. In 6 weeks he was able to walk without a walker, just with a cane, speak in complete sentences, although with strange diction, use his right hand for most things, and even regain some movement in his left. During this time the lawsuit was progressing. There were 3 additional hearings. Witnesses were called. Sandra testified about what she heard that day at the hospital. My neighbor, Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, 72 years old, lived 3 houses down the same street for 25 years, testified that she had seen over the years how neglectful my children were, how many holidays I spent alone, how she would sometimes find me crying in the garden. My distant cousin, James Torres, 58 years old, who had borrowed money from Eduardo years ago and never received it back, testified about his dubious character. My bank statements were presented showing a constant flow of money going from my account to their accounts for decades. Emails were read out loud where they promised to return it and never did. Graph technical examination of the false power of attorney was officially presented. Their lawyer tried to argue that donations to children were normal, that maternal love included financial help. But David brilliantly countered by showing the difference between helping out of love and being systematically exploited. It showed that while I transferred thousands to them, my own account often had a low balance. It showed that I had put off expensive dental work for years to save money while paying for a luxury vacation for them. It showed that I had given up on knee surgery that the doctor had recommended because I couldn't pay the $4,000 of the deductible, while at the same time I transferred $6,000 to Roberto without question. The fifth hearing was final. 6 months after starting everything, I was already walking without a cane. Speaking practically normally, I had recovered 70% of the mobility in my left arm. I went to court in person, wearing a navy blue dress that I bought especially for the occasion, neat white hair and light makeup. I wanted the judge and everyone to see that I was not senile. I was not incapable. I was an intelligent and conscious woman who had been abused by her own children. I saw the 3 of them for the first time since Eduardo's explosion in the hospital. They were sitting on the other side of the court with their expensive lawyer, all dressed formally, Eduardo in a gray suit, Carolina in a black dress, Roberto in a blue blazer. They looked at me when I entered, and I saw surprise on their faces. I think they expected to see me still weak. They almost expected that the stroke would miraculously prove some point in them. Their disappointment was visible. Judge Hamilton Moore entered, everyone stood up, and the session began. He said that he had analyzed all the evidence presented during months of the process, had read all the statements, had consulted with experts, and had reached clear conclusions. He looked at my children with a disapproving expression and said that he had rarely seen such a blatant case of elderly financial abuse combined with emotional neglect and attempted document fraud. He said their behavior was not only legally reprehensible, but morally deplorable. Then he read the sentence point by point. 1. Eduardo's forged power of attorney was declared null and void. Eduardo was ordered to pay a fine of $50,000 to the state plus court costs, and the case was referred to criminal prosecutors with a recommendation for prosecution. 2. All 3 were jointly ordered to pay me compensation for moral damages in the amount of $400,000 to be divided, $133,334 each. 3. All 3 were ordered to return specific amounts that they borrowed and never paid. Eduardo, $25,000, Carolina, $45,000, Roberto, $85,000, all with interest and correction from the last years, totaling respectively $38,000, $67,000, and $125,000. 4. The title of the car that was irregularly in Carolina's name was reverted to my name. 5. Joint account that Eduardo had access to was closed and remaining balance reverted to me. 6. Restraining order was permanently maintained. None of them could come near me or my residence without my explicit written permission. 7. Were removed as beneficiaries of my will and no longer had any hereditary rights to my assets. Total they owed was $633,000 altogether. The judge gave them 6 months to pay in installments or their assets would be seized. I left the court in silence, David beside me smiling discreetly. We got into his car, and I burst into tears as soon as he closed the door. They were tears of relief, of exhaustion, of bitter victory. It wasn't happiness. How could it be? I had been proven right. I had secured financial justice, but I had lost my children, or rather, I had woken up to the reality that I never actually had the children I thought I had. Back at home, caregiver Angela welcomed me with a warm hug. She had prepared a delicious dinner, vegetable soup with fresh bread. I ate in silence in the kitchen, looking out the window at the garden I planted 30 years ago, each tree chosen with care, each flower representing my children's growing season. Now the garden needed maintenance. Some plants had died during the months I was hospitalized and in intensive recovery. but others had survived and even flourished on their own. It was a perfect metaphor. 3 months passed, and I began the process of truly rebuilding my life. First month, I received the first installment of the judgment payment, $105,000. They made an agreement to pay in 6 equal installments so as not to have assets seized immediately. I used $50,000 to completely renovate the house, new paint in bright, cheerful colors, new and more comfortable furniture. I replaced old carpets with laminate flooring that was easier to clean and safer for me, who still had slight difficulty balancing. I sold old furniture and decorations that had bad memories. I bought new pieces that were just mine, with no painful stories attached. I invested $80,000 in a conservative fund that yielded $6,000 a year, supplementing my retirement of $1,900 a month from Social Security. With a paid-off house, no debts, and investments, I finally had real financial security for the first time in my life. I no longer needed full-time caregivers. Angela came 3 times a week for a few hours to help with heavy cleaning and keep us company, and we ended up becoming real friends. Socially, my world has opened up in unexpected ways. Donna Margaret, a neighbor who testified for me, invited me to a group of ladies that met every Thursday to play cards and talk about life. The group had 7 women between 62 and 79 years old, all with their own stories of overcoming. I started attending. They welcomed me without invasive questions, just with genuine acceptance. Through them, I discovered a community center for the elderly that offered dozens of activities. I signed up for a watercolor painting class, something I always wanted to do but never had the time, and I discovered that I was reasonably talented. A teacher, a lady named Patricia Nguyen, 75 years old, Vietnamese who had immigrated in the 70s, encouraged me to participate in the group exhibition that the center held every year. I exhibited 3 paintings, sold 2 for $100 each. It was symbolic value, but the satisfaction was enormous. I also joined a morning walking group in the park, 10 people who met at 6:30 every morning to walk 5 kilometers. Exercise was good for physical rehabilitation and mental health. In the group, I met a widower named Martin Chen, 70 years old, retired from a telecommunications company, Asian American born in San Francisco. Polite, kind, funny. We started hiking together, then coffee after hikes, then occasional lunches, and we developed genuine friendships that were comfortable and pressure-free. He also had children who were distant. He understood pain without me having to explain much. A full year after the court ruling, I was unrecognizably different from the woman who had suffered a stroke. Physically, he had recovered 95% of his functions, only slight weakness remained in his left hand, which limited very delicate tasks, but did not prevent normal life. Weight had stabilized at 58 pounds, healthy for my 5'2" height. Blood pressure controlled, cholesterol excellent, last medical checkup had been perfect. Emotionally, I had difficult days, especially on dates that used to be family gatherings. Thanksgiving spent alone for the first time was torture, Christmas too, but I managed to deal with it without falling apart. The support group for survivors of family abuse that I started attending at the community center helped me immensely. There were 12 women who met every Monday night. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone, less strange, less defective. Financially, I was better than ever. I had received all the installments of the sentence, a total of $633,000. I invested $500,000 in a diversified portfolio of bonds and conservative shares, generating a monthly income of $2,500 with Social Security. I was living comfortably on $4,400 a month. I spent little, lived simply, but for the first time, I had no anxiety about money. I set aside $50,000 for future medical emergencies. I used $30,000 to go on the trip I always dreamed of, a 20-day cruise along the west coast of Mexico to Alaska, alone, but I met wonderful people on the boat, other alone ladies, elderly couples, all more interested in genuine conversation and natural beauty than in superficialities. I came back renewed. Occasional news about my children arrived through mutual acquaintances. Eduardo lost his job at the consultancy. Apparently the criminal conviction for document forgery, even though it was just a heavy fine and community service, not prison, tarnished his professional reputation. He tried to open his own consultancy, but clients didn't come. Last I heard, I was working in a junior position at a smaller company, earning a third of what I was earning before. His marriage was in crisis. His wife was considering divorce. House worth $250,000 had to be sold at a loss to pay part of the debts with me. Now they lived in a smaller rented house. Carolina also lost her apartment, went back to live with her daughters in a rented house. Her relationship with the girls became tense because they asked questions about her grandmother and because they had to change schools and leave friends behind. She developed depression, was undergoing expensive psychiatric treatment that she could barely afford. Roberto was the most financially resilient. His business continued to operate, but socially it was destroyed. Customers from the Mexican community where he operated were left alone. Knowing history through gossip, Mexican culture values family, especially respect for the elderly. He was practically ostracized, losing 40% of his contracts. He had to hire more employees because customers didn't want to deal with him directly. Marriage also suffered. Wife was embarrassed. I didn't feel any pleasure knowing these things. It was just empty. They had done it to themselves. I had just defended myself. Sometimes I caught myself thinking about how different life would be if they had been decent people, if they had truly loved me, if gratitude had existed. But these thoughts led nowhere, so I learned to deflect them. 18 months after the sentence, I was sitting on the porch of my house on a Saturday morning, 10:30, perfect spring weather, 22 degrees, cloudless blue sky, drinking coffee and reading a book when I saw a car stop in front of the house. It was Carolina. She got out of the car, closed the door slowly, and stood on the sidewalk looking at me. I had lost a lot of weight. My hair that had always been impeccable was untreated, my clothes were simple, my posture was hunched over. I remained absolutely motionless in the chair, expressionless on my face, waiting. She took 2 steps towards the house but stopped because she remembered the restriction order. She couldn't enter the property without my permission. We stared at each other in silence for maybe 2 full minutes. Then she spoke, her weak voice carrying a distance of about 50 feet between us. I said I knew I had no right to be there, that I knew I had destroyed everything, that I wasn't asking for forgiveness because I didn't deserve it. I wasn't asking for money because I didn't have the nerve. I just wanted me to know that she thought about me every day. That regret consumed her life. That she had lost everything and understood too late what a greater loss it was to have her mother. That her daughters asked about their grandmother, and she didn't know what to answer. That she had started therapy and the therapist had suggested trying to make amends even though she knew I could reject it. And that if I wanted her, I would leave and never come back. But if there was any part of me that could consider with time maybe allowing her to rebuild something, she would be willing to spend the rest of her life proving that she has changed. He finished speaking and waited, tears streaming down his face. I remained motionless for another full minute. Then I got up from my chair, picked up my empty coffee mug, went inside the house, and closed the door behind me without saying a word. I stood leaning against the door from the inside, listening. I heard her sobbing outside for maybe 5 minutes. Then I heard footsteps moving away, the car starting, the sound of the engine fading. I went back to the balcony. She was gone. I sat in the same chair and realized that I wasn't shaking. I wasn't crying. I wasn't feeling either angry or sorry. Just deep tiredness. Tiredness of carrying pain, of reliving betrayal, of keeping hurt burning. But I wasn't ready to do anything about it. Maybe I never would be. Forgiveness did not mean reconciliation. Understanding her regret did not mean accepting it back. She had made choices. She had to live with the consequences, just as I had to live with the consequences of her choices that had broken my life in half. 2 full years have passed since that horrible day in the hospital when I discovered their plan. It was Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock, autumn, a pleasant temperature of 18 degrees. I was in the new kitchen that had been completely remodeled. White cabinets, gray granite countertops, modern appliances, everything paid for with money that I recovered in court. I was making pancakes for breakfast, a recipe I learned at the cooking group I started attending, when I heard the doorbell ring. I didn't expect anyone. I dried my hands on the tea towel and went to the door, looked through the window and saw Eduardo standing outside. My first instinct was not to open it, but something made me open it with just the safety chain attached. He was visibly aged, whiter hair, deep wrinkles around his eyes, simple casual clothes. He asked for just 5 minutes to talk. I hesitated, but ended up taking the chain and opening the door. I stood in the doorway without inviting him to enter. He began to speak, voice choked, saying that he had reached rock bottom, he had lost practically everything, his marriage had ended, his children no longer spoke to him properly because they had discovered what he did to me and lost respect. He was working a humble job delivering food via app to pay bills. He lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment. He had started therapy and finally, he was seeing the monstrosity of what he had done. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, he didn't deserve it, but he needed to take full responsibility without blaming it on stress or the influence of his brothers. It had been his choice to forge the document. He had been chosen. His plan was to discard his mother as if she were trash, and he would have to carry this shame until he died. He said that he had written a letter to the judge assuming full guilt and removing any blame from Carolina and Roberto, that the judge had reduced their convictions because of that. He said he sold personal belongings to complete payment of the last installments to me. He said that he thought about irony every day, that he spent his entire life looking at me as a source of resources and never as a human being, and that he only realized the humanity and dignity of his own mother when he completely destroyed the relationship. He spoke for perhaps 8 minutes, and I listened in complete silence. When he finished, I looked into his eyes, into the same brown eyes that he inherited from his father, from the Roberto that I loved with every cell of my being, and I said calmly, "I hear your regret, and I believe it is real because you lost everything, and that is the only thing humans learn through pain and loss. But regret does not undo damage. You heard me lying paralyzed in a hospital bed, planning to throw myself away. You heard me beg silently with my eyes, and you chose to continue. You forged my signature by looking at documents that I assinei para construir a vida que você tem. Cada letra que você copiou foi traição repetida. Você olhou para minha cara e mentiu com um sorriso nos lábios. Isso não sai, Eduardo. Isso não é perdoado com palavras bonitas e terapia paga. Você não vai ter segunda chance comigo. Não vai ter reconciliação. Não vai ter almoços de domingo. Não vai ter ligações de aniversário. Quando eu morrer, você não vai ser avisado. Meu testamento está feito. Você não está nele. Nenhum de vocês 3 está. Tudo goes to charities that help elderly people abused by families. That's my last word on this. Now get off my property." I closed the door in his face. I heard him stand on the other side for maybe a minute. Then I heard footsteps coming down the porch stairs, front gate opening and closing. I went back to the kitchen. Pancakes had cooled. I threw them away and made new ones. I sat alone at the 4-seater table with just 1 seat set, ate slowly, savoring each bite, and felt peace. It wasn't happiness. It was peace. Acceptance of what chapter had ended, what page had turned, what life continued without them. 3 full years since the stroke. Tuesday morning, exact date, 3 years ago, I was on the kitchen floor, unable to move, waiting for an ambulance. Today, I was standing in the same kitchen that had been completely transformed, body strong again, mind clear, life rebuilt brick by brick. I had turned 70 on my last birthday, a small but happy party with friends from the card group, Angela and Rosa, who continued to be friends even though they no longer worked for me professionally, Martin, who was getting closer and closer, and there were already subtle signs that friendship could turn into something more romantic if I allowed it, and some ladies from the Baptist church that I started attending not for religion, but for community. Gifts were modest but meaningful. Books, chocolates, handmade scarves, things carefully chosen with me specifically in mind. None of my children have been in touch. I didn't expect them to come in. Equity was solid. The paid-off house was now worth $700,000 due to the appreciation of the neighborhood. Investments had grown to $550,000 with a good market. They generated $3,000 a month. Total monthly income was $5,400 with Social Security. I spent around $3,500, so I had almost $2,000 left over per month that I continued to invest. Health was excellent. All exams were normal. I walked 8 kilometers 4 times a week, practiced yoga for the elderly twice, painted 3 afternoons, participated in the church choir, which I discovered had a reasonable voice. I had sold 7 paintings in the last year, $400 in total. Nothing financially significant, but huge emotional validation. A small local museum had included one of my works in an exhibition of amateur artists, an autumn garden painting that a local critic had described as melancholic but hopeful, a perfect description of how I saw my own life. I had started writing memoirs, not necessarily to publish, but as a therapeutic process of organizing trauma and overcoming it. I already had 140 handwritten pages that perhaps one day would become a book that would help other elderly women in similar situations. Relationship with Martin evolved. It wasn't obvious youthful passion. We were both too old for that, but it was deep companionship and genuine affection. He treated me with respect that I had forgotten existed, asked my opinion about everything, really listened when I spoke, remembered small details of conversations we had weeks ago, brought my favorite tea when he came to visit me, offered his arm without me asking when we walked together. Irregular launch, never imposed presence, but was always available when I needed it. We'd had dinner together every Friday night for the past 6 months, alternating cooking for each other or going to cheap but cozy restaurants. He had kissed my forehead 3 weeks ago when he said goodbye after a particularly pleasant dinner, a gesture so tender and respectful that it had brought tears to my eyes, and I realized that I was developing genuine romantic feelings for the first time in the 14 years since my Roberto's death. I didn't know if I was ready for a serious relationship at that age, but I was open to finding out. Social life was fuller than it had ever been, even when my children were present, because now they were real connections chosen by affinity, not by blood obligation. Letter group on Thursdays, morning walk every day with the park group, watercolor class on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, church choir on Sunday morning, support group on Monday night, dinner with Martin on Friday, possibly lunches or walks with friends on Saturdays. Calendar was full. A house that was once empty and silent now received visitors regularly. I had made tea for the girls last week, 5 friends around the table laughing at silly stories, eating cookies I made, planning the next trip we were organizing together, a weekend in New Orleans in 2 months, 8 ladies renting a big house on Airbnb, sharing costs, planning sightseeing trips and meals. None of them knew the full story with my children. They only knew that the relationship was non-existent. They didn't judge, they didn't ask invasive questions, they just included me in everything without distinction. It was freedom I had never experienced. Thinking about my children now no longer caused sharp pain. It was dull and distant pain. The kind of pain that you learn to live with like someone who lives with chronic arthritis, always present but not disabling. I still had moments, usually late at night when I was alone and my mind was wandering, where I found myself imagining alternative scenarios, where they had been different, where relationships were healthy, where I would have grandchildren visiting for cookies and stories, where Christmas would be a loving reunion. But reality soon returned, and I accepted that it never really existed. It was always a fantasy that I built, because mothers want to believe that children are good. The truth is that they have always been selfish. Signs had been there since childhood, if I was honest. The way they took toys without thanks, how they threw tantrums when they didn't get what they wanted, how they manipulated to get things, how they rarely showed genuine empathy, how they compared what I gave them with what other children had without gratitude for what they had. I attributed it to kids being kids, to teenage hormones, to young adult stress, always finding excuses, always giving the benefit of the doubt, always believing that a bad phase would pass. But it wasn't a phase, it was character. and character rarely changes, especially after 40. The next day I went to the cemetery to visit Roberto's grave. I do this on the first Tuesday of every month religiously. I always take fresh flowers, white carnations that were his favorites. I sat on the stone bench in front of the headstone, a simple gray granite headstone with his name, dates of birth and death, and the phrase I chose years ago, beloved husband and father, forever in our hearts. The last part was a lie now, at least in relation to the children, but he wasn't going to change the tombstone. I spoke to him out loud as I always do. I told him about recent events, about Martin, about the planned trip, about the art exhibition. I told him that Eduardo had come to look for me, that I had refused reconciliation, and I asked out loud if he would approve of my decision. The wind blew softly between the trees in the cemetery, and I chose to interpret it as an affirmative answer. Roberto had been a good man, an honest worker, a present father while he lived, an attentive husband. If he had been alive, he wouldn't have let children treat their mother like that. He would have put them in line. Or perhaps, if he had lived, they would have developed better character with a father figure present during complete training. There was no way of knowing. I spent 45 minutes there, cleaned dry leaves around the grave, arranged flowers in the vase embedded in the tombstone, said goodbye until the following month. I returned home and received a call from David, my lawyer who had become a friend throughout the process. He called occasionally to check on me. We were both survivors of complicated families. He understood in a way that most people didn't. We talked for 30 minutes about pleasantries. He said that he had accepted 3 new cases of financial abuse of the elderly in the last few months, all similar to mine. He was becoming almost an expert in the area. He said that my case had been a huge learning experience, and what strategies developed to defend myself he was using to help other people. I said I was happy that my pain had served something greater positive. He said I was the strongest woman he knew, that he admired how I had rebuilt my life, that I should be proud. I hung up the phone feeling warmth in my chest, genuine pride. 6 months later, I was in New Orleans with a group of friends, the first international trip I had taken other than a cruise alone. We were 8 ladies between 65 and 76 years old. We rented a large 3-bedroom house in the French Quarter. We woke up early. We had breakfast together laughing and planning our day. We spent the morning visiting museums or walking along historic streets. We had lunch at local restaurants trying Cajun and Creole cuisine. The afternoon we rested at the house. The evening we went out for dinner and live music. It was pure, carefree joy, no family tension, no emotional obligations, just a group of mature women enjoying life. One night we were in a jazz bar, amazing live music, each of us with a drink in hand, me with a hurricane that the waitress had recommended, and Margaret, who was sitting next to me, leaned over and said in my ear that she was happy that I had joined the group years ago, that I had added so much life and joy to their circle, that I was an inspiration to them all. I looked around the table, 8 women each with their own story of loss, overcoming, resilience, all laughing together at a joke that one had told, and I felt deep gratitude. This was my family now, a chosen family, not of blood, but of affinity and mutual choice. I returned from my renewed trip and found a registered letter waiting. It was from Carolina. She hadn't tried contacting him again after that car day almost 2 years ago. I opened the letter with hands shaking slightly. It was long, 5 handwritten pages, her handwriting that I recognized immediately. She talked about her life in detail, about therapy she went to 3 times a week, about having finally gotten a stable job in an accounting office, about her daughters who were growing up and asking questions about their grandmother that they barely knew, about the depression medication she was taking, about how she had sold absolutely everything that had value to pay the last installment of her debt to me 2 months before the deadline, about the 12-step group she had joined even though it wasn't about alcohol or drugs, but about family abuse she committed, about how one of the steps was to make amends with people she had hurt. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't suggest a meeting. She just wanted me to know that she worked every day to be a better person, that she taught her daughters about gratitude and respect in ways she clearly hadn't learned, that she volunteered time at a nursing home trying to make up for the horrible karma she created, that she had set up a small educational fund in my name at a local university where any elderly woman who wanted to go back to school could apply for a scholarship. She had put in $5,000 initially and planned to add $1,000 a year. He ended by saying that he didn't expect a response, that he understood perfectly if I threw the letter in the trash without finishing reading it, but that I needed to try to communicate in some way that the change was real and permanent. I read the letter 3 times, folded it carefully, and put it in a desk drawer. I didn't throw it away, but I didn't respond either. Maybe one day I would answer, maybe not. For now, I left the door of possibility ajar a millimeter, no more than that. The present merged with a comfortable and satisfying routine. Days that used to drag on when I was unhappy and alone emotionally now flew by, busy with activities and people. Martin had officially asked us to date. I had my first official relationship at 71 years old, absurd and wonderful simultaneously. We didn't live together or plan. We both valued independence and our own space too much, but we spent 4 or 5 nights a week together, switching houses, cooking for each other, watching movies, talking for hours about everything and nothing. He had encyclopedic knowledge of history that I loved hearing. I had life experiences that he found fascinating. Sexuality existed in a gentle and respectful, age-appropriate way. It was not urgent or performative, but it was genuine and satisfying. He had known Carolina and Eduardo, not personally, but through stories. He never tried to convince me to forgive or reconcile. He just listened when I needed to talk about it. 4 full years since the initial stroke, a dark anniversary that I chose not to celebrate, but also not to ignore, I marked it with a visit to the hospital where it all began, Mercy Hospital. I asked to speak to Sandra, the nurse who had literally saved me. Reception said she still worked there. Night shift, she could come back after 8. I returned at 8:15, went up to the floor where I had been admitted, and asked at the nurse's station to speak to Sandra. She appeared 5 minutes later, recognized me immediately even 4 years later, her face lit up and hugged me tightly. We went to the empty restroom and talked for 40 minutes. I told him about everything that happened after discharge, about the legal process, about victory, about the new life built. I brought her a gift, a basket with fine chocolates and a handwritten card thanking her for believing in me when I was most vulnerable, for taking a job risk by getting documents, for being an ally when I had none. She cried while reading the card, said that she only did the right thing, that unfortunately she saw similar cases too often, that most of them didn't end well because victims didn't have the strength to fight, that she was immensely happy knowing that my story had ended with justice. He said he had used my case as an example in staff training on signs of elder abuse. I left the hospital with a feeling of a closed circle, of expressed gratitude, of life that makes sense again. I am currently 73 years old, 6 full years since that horrible day that I thought had destroyed my life, but was actually a catalyst for rebuilding a true and authentic life. This morning, Saturday, 10 in the morning, sitting on the porch of the house that I restored and transformed, surrounded by pots of flowers that I personally plant and care for, drinking chamomile tea that I grow in the garden, waiting for Martin to arrive so we can go together to the farmer's market to buy fresh vegetables for lunch that we will prepare together. The weather forecast is for a sunny day, 25 degrees, perfect for the hike we plan to take in the afternoon at the state park 20 miles to the north. Tomorrow, Sunday, I will sing in the church choir, second support group meeting, Tuesday watercolor class, Wednesday lunch with the girls, Thursday card group, Friday romantic dinner with Martin in a new Italian restaurant that opened, next Saturday group art exhibition where I have 2 pieces. Full calendar, full life. Bank account with $640,000 invested generating $300 and $500 monthly, house worth $730,000, perfect health, according to the last complete checkup last month. More important than numbers, peace. I sleep 8 hours every night. I wake up without anxiety. I look in the mirror and recognize a woman looking back. A strong, independent, dignified woman. My children are no longer an active part of my life. They are complex memories that I have learned to process and archive. Carolina continues to send an annual letter on my birthday. I read them all, but I have never responded yet. Maybe one day I will respond, maybe never. I left the possibility open without commitment. Eduardo never tried to contact me again after that last time. Roberto disappeared completely. Will is updated, revised 3 months ago, leaves house to Martin, who was added as beneficiary after 2 years of dating. Investments divided between 5 charities focused on protecting the elderly and preventing family abuse. Pieces of art go to local museum, personal effects to closest friends with specific instructions. None of the 3 children mentioned except for an explicit clause saying they were intentionally excluded to avoid challenges. If you've made it this far, please comment from which city you're watching us, because this story needs to go far. Leave a like if you believe that it is never too late to start over, and that family is not those who share blood, but those who share respect. I learned in the most painful way possible that dignity is not negotiable, that genuine love does not exploit, that a true family is one that chooses to stay not out of obligation, but out of desire. I spent 67 years believing that I had built a loving family, 3 children that I loved more than my own life, and I discovered that I built a sandcastle that collapsed with the first real wave. But from the wreckage I emerged stronger, more aware, more alive than I had ever been. It wasn't easy. There were nights crying myself to sleep. There were moments of wanting to give up. There was pain that seemed endless. But as long as you breathe, you have the power to change history. I changed mine. You can too. Never accept being treated as disposable. Never allow abuse justified by blood ties. Never let fear of loneliness make you tolerate cruelty. Better alone with dignity than surrounded by people who diminish you. And if you find yourself alone, look around. A community of genuine people exists. All you need is the courage to seek and the vulnerability to accept. Today, at 73 years old, for the first time in my life, I am truly happy. Not despite the loss of my children, but through it I discovered who I really am, what I really deserve, and what I'm worth. This is my story, from the bottom, from the well to complete reconstruction, from the most brutal family betrayal to true peace. And if a 70-year-old woman paralyzed in a hospital bed with no voice and no allies managed to turn things around and regain her life, so can you. As long as there is breath, there is hope. As long as there is consciousness, there is power. Use that power, defend yourself, rebuild yourself, flourish.